ReactJS is probably the most important and useful JavaScript library out there at the moment. And I call it a library very specifically because it's not a framework. In fact, it is just an HTML rendering library. It doesn't really do anything else. It's not a web development framework like it's sometimes called. Frameworks have routing, they have folder structure, they have all kinds of other tools that we use as a developer to build our applications. React really has one goal, and that is to create a system of converting data into HTML so that the user can see the data on their screen. So when you use React in the most pure form without some kind of framework like Next.js, you really need to think of your own folder structure. And even something like Next.js only has very minimal folder structure that it kind of offers you. You still have to think about structuring your code yourself. That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to set up an empty new React project, and we're going to use a folder structure that I really enjoy, that I've built multiple applications with right now. And I think it's the most easy to get started with, but also scales very well. It's very easy to add new features to this folder structure without having to relocate all kinds of files or folders. So I've opened an empty folder in VS Code, and I'm going to run npm create vite because I'm using the module bundler vite as the tool behind React here. So this is going to set up our React application. I'm going to say period for my project name, meaning that vite will simply take my folder name. And we can actually check React, and I'm actually going to use TypeScript. It really doesn't matter if you're using TypeScript or JavaScript in this video, because we're just going to focus on the folder structure here. Let's npm install all of the dependencies, including vite itself and React. And then we're going to run npm run dev to set up a little development server that vite is going to host for us. And there we have the example vite React app. Now, just to get started with this folder structure, I'm basically going to clear out everything. So the public folder here, if you don't know, the public folder holds all of the files that will be once the application is running in the root of your server. So you can basically request these files publicly from the root of your server. It's basically yourwebsite.com/ and then in this case vite.svg. I'm just going to delete that. We have no need for that in this video. And in the source, I'm also going to delete everything apart from this main.tsx file. This is the main startup file for your React application. And I'm actually going to remove the imports for this app component and the CSS file. And let's just clear the app component out there completely. So right now, all that we have is an index.html that will be loaded in the browser. So right here, we have that index.html file loaded in the browser. It contains a body with pretty much an empty div. And it has a... Oh, and my cat is jumping around. Let's leave her there. And that's very distracting. And we have a script tag here. That points to main.tsx. So main.tsx is this file here. So vite will run, or the browser will run this file whenever the application is going to start in the browser. Enjoy the back of my cat here. So this is your startup file, right? Now we're using React DOM here. And this is going to create the root component of the React application. And it's going to place that root component in the element it will find with the ID root. So that's going to be this div. So anything that we are going to create in React, any component that we will put in this render function, is going to be inserted in this div with the ID of root. That is in its core how React works. So now we want to create components. Components are functions that basically return some generated HTML. So, by the way, this React strict mode component is there just for giving us warnings of unsafe and bad code, basically. So we just leave that there for the development process. All right, so now we want to create all of these components. We want pages, we want components on the pages, we want routers so that we can switch components for different pages. There's all kinds of other things we might want. We're using TypeScript, so I want type definition files. So how are we going to organize all of that? So the way that I like to organize is using two main folders. One called common and one called modules. This is also sometimes called features. So the common folder will have all of the code, all of the React components, all of the hooks, all of the type definitions for just general features of our our application that don't really belong to one specific feature, let's say. So if we're creating, let's say, a social media app that has posts and comments and user accounts, those would be the 3 main features of the app. And I'm going to make folders in the modules folder for those 3 modules or features, sections or parts of your application. The common folder is there for just general things that don't belong to one of these main features, like the homepage, for example, or maybe some type definition that you use everywhere throughout your app, or like a component for the nav bar. So that would be just your general components that you could use everywhere, basically. They don't belong to one of the main features. So let's start in this common folder and set up some very basic things. Specifically, I want to set up React Router so that we can switch components, and I want to use components for different pages, and we can switch them with React Router depending on which URL we are visiting. So I'm going to create a routers folder here, and this is going to hold all of my router stuff. Now, I'm really going to have one main router, so let's call this the root router.tsx. So it's a bit useless to put it in its own folder, but there could be situations where you want to have multiple routers. But in this case, we'll just have the root router of our application. And in this file, I'm just simply going to export a default export. And it's going to be a function, because we're going to use function components here. And it's going to be the root router function. And we're going to use React Router, which we're going to install with npm. npm install React Router. And we want the React Router DOM version, Document Object Model. This is the React Router for the browser, basically. There's also React Router for I think for the React Native and some other platforms. But we want the browser DOM variant. So what this offers us, we can return out of this component, a component called browser router. And sometimes VS Code doesn't find the import. So what I do is just Ctrl-Shift-P, reload the window. And we should now hopefully have access to that. There it is. And this just allows us to auto import from the right location and the right package. So this browser router is kind of like a provider for routing functionalities to any of the child components we put in here. Then I'm going to create another component called routes, plural routes. And this is going to be the component that React Router uses to basically switch individual routes depending on URL. So now we need to define these individual routes. So let's define a route. And this is just a self-closing component. So make sure we import all 3. And then we have to specify which path we want to check. So I'm going to say / the home page. And then we say element. And this is which element or which JSX element, which components we want to render. So for now, I'm just going to render a paragraph that says hello world. So what we have done here is we specified if the path is /, we want to render the element paragraph hello world. That's what we've done here. So we've just hard-coded some content in this router, which we're going to remove later. We want to have page components, but for now we'll leave it like that. Now this root router needs to, of course, be applied somewhere in our app. So we could go into the main.tsx and just add the root router in here. And for now I'm going to do that, but we're going to organize this a bit better in a moment. So the root router is added to the page. It checks if the path is /, and then to the actual DOM, it's going to output this paragraph. And let's reload here. And as you can see, we have hello world on our page here. If I go to a different path, however, something that we don't have currently a route for or a page support for, nothing is going to be shown. And that makes sense because we in our router have only listed a path / for one of the routes. And this paragraph or anything else will not be rendered if the path is anything else. So we can actually set up another route. And I'm going to set up the path. And we're going to use this asterisk symbol. And this is kind of like the wildcard. It selects anything. So if there's any other path, I'm going to just say p not found. Or like the 404 not found error. So there we go. We now have on this non-existing path not found. And if I go to / we have hello world. Now you may think, well, this wildcard selects everything. Why doesn't everything, including / match this path and display this paragraph not found 404? Well, that's because the routes have priority. The topmost route here has the highest priority. So if the path is actually exactly /, it will match this element or it will apply this element. And if it's anything else than this, if we haven't found the path slash, then we check the next routes, and then it's the wildcard. So basically this says anything else. So I'm going to list all of the routes that I want to support above this final like catch-all or fallback route for the not found page, basically. Now we can improve this a little bit by actually creating pages. So I'm going to create in common a pages folder, and I'm going to create the not found 404.tsx file, and we'll export a default function not found 404 as a component. And I'm for now just simply going to return, let's do a main element, because this will be the main section of this page. And we're just going to have an h1 here. Your page was not found. And we'll just have a paragraph. We'll say 404 not found as the actual HTTP status. So now in the root router, we can actually switch this paragraph around, and we just simply render the not found 404 component. So let's optimize it a little bit. So we now have a different page here, or a different folder for our pages. So if I go to a non-existing page, we have that message here. Now, if I'm on this 404 page, I have no way to navigate back to, for example, the home page. So let's create a navigation bar. So the navigation bar is basically going to be part of the layout for pretty much every page. So I'm going to create a folder for layout. And this is for components that really are just sections of the page that basically need to wrap around every page, like the navbar or a footer. So let's create a navbar, tsx, export default function navbar. And I'm going to return, and let's create a nav element. And instead of a tags, I'm going to use the React Router link components. This makes sure that React Router will be reacting to switches in our URL. So the link needs a to instead of an href property. Can be just a string, and I'm going to say slash, and we'll say home. And then we also, I'm just going to set up an posts page here, which we don't have yet, but in a moment I'm going to create some an actual post module for this fake social media app we are kind of making as this example. So it's going to be my navbar here for now. We can of course add things later. Now what I could do is go into the not found 404 page and just say, well, okay, so above the main element we want the navbar, but we can't export or return multiple elements, so now we have to put this in a fragment. It's a bit of a mess, but this will work. But now my home page doesn't have that navbar. So it would be nice if I had a quick way to just add the navbar and maybe some other parts of the layout to all of my pages. So let's remove this navbar again. So we'll just return the actual content of the 404 page. Let's actually close this. And what I'm going to do in layout is create the main layout.tsx. It's going to be the main layout of the page. Layout is just going to be everything that we want to wrap around all the pages. The individual pages can be different, but the main layout wraps around all the pages regardless of what they are. And it will include the navbar and maybe some other things. So export again, default function, the main layout. Now, what I'm going to do here is actually as a property, I'm going to ask for a property called children. And this is a React feature that allows us to wrap this main layout component around other components and elements. And we get those other components and elements as the children prop. And we can then decide where in this main component we're going to place them. Now, because we're using TypeScript, we have to declare what children is. And in TypeScript, children, or well, the children prop is of the type react.reactNode. It's a specific React type that basically specifies a node in the hierarchical tree of components and elements. So children is just one node in this tree. I'm actually going to specify a type for this, and I'm going to call this the main layout props. And I'm going to say that children is going to be of the type React, and we will have to import React for that, .react node. And now we can specify that the object that we are destructuring from props is of the type main layout props. Very nice. So there's a bit of TypeScript. And then in the component itself, we can just return. And what I'm going to do is return basically a fragment. We don't really care about what the main layout itself is, but the main layout is going to render my nav bar. And then below that, we're going to insert all of the children elements and components. So now what I can do is I can go to my pages, and all I have to do is to wrap my main layout component around all of the children elements and components. So these elements here will be sent into the main layout component as the children prop, and we are rendering them under the navbar. So now in our 4.4 page, we will have the navbar, and all I have to do in my home page, which we don't really have yet, but it's this paragraph, I would basically have to wrap this inside of that main layout as well. So we're going to do that in a moment. But just first, to just add something more to the layout, let's add a footer, just so we have some more examples here. Export default function footer. And this is simply going to return an actual footer semantic element. And we're just going to say p copyright dev history 2023. And that's going to be my footer. And so now I can simply add this to every page that uses the main layout by simply adding it, let's say below the children, in the main layout. So if I go to that 4.4 page, now we have that footer. And every page that wraps inside of that main layout will get that footer as well. And we can add all kinds of stuff in there. Cool. So let's add another page. We're going to make the home page here. And it's, again, all under the common folder. You could maybe say that the home page is a module. If you have loads of functionality on your home page, that may very well be. But I'm just going to have a pretty simple React function component that simply exports some HTML or JSX, really. So home. And really all that I'm going to do is return that main layout. That's the only thing I have to do here. And we're going to wrap inside of it the main element, because we don't want this to be part of the nav or the footer element. It's actually the main content element of the page. And let's say on the home page we'll just have an h1 that says welcome to the website. Some very simple stuff. So now our home page, and of course we should still add the home page to the router. So when the path is / we will render home. Make sure we import home. There we go. So let's go to the home, and now we can actually switch these web pages. Of course, the posts page doesn't exist yet, right? We haven't made it. So we have this fallback 4.4 page. So it works just fine. Cool. Now, one other thing that I like to do with, for example, the router is not actually add the router to the main or the main file. Because we may want other components to basically wrap around all the pages. For example, let's say that we have user accounts and we want to have in our memory which users logged in as a variable. And I want to be able to give all of the pages and components access to that user. So we could use something like ReactContext, which I'm actually going to set up later in this video. Now the context is a component that needs to wrap around other things. So then we would have in this main file some kind of context component that wraps around the router. But I might need context for all kinds of stuff. So there might be 5 or 6 or even more elements. So I don't really want in my main file, which is responsible for just starting the React process really, to determine where all of those other files or all of the other components are going to go. So in my common folder, I'm going to create a providers folder. And in there, I'm going to create the main app provider. And this is kind of going to be a wrapper component that just takes any provider we want to give globally to the whole application, and we can just render them around all of the other child components of that app provider. Let's check it out. So export default function app provider. And again, we are going to need to ask for the children prop. And I'm going to create an app provider props type here. App provider props, and we're just going to say children is of the type React node. There it is. All right, so then we can accept children, and then we are simply going to, for example, return a fragment. And for now, all I'm going to do is add the root router in there. But we can extend this and actually dump all of those other context providers and other providers around this if I need them. Actually, we didn't need children here. I made a massive mistake. We have no need for children because the root router will determine which pages will be rendered. Those are basically going to be the children. So we have no need for that. So that simplifies things. In the main then, I'm not going to render the router. I'm going to render the app provider with anything that it provides. So there we go. We can get rid of that. And this is now the main file. We're not going to touch that anymore. I can extend this. I can wrap more components that need to expose their values to the child components in the router, the pages basically, around this root router here. All right, so that is that. That makes sure the router still works, and it does. So there we have it. That is kind of my common setup here. So let's start to think about some modules. Let's create a folder for posts. So this is a specific feature or part or module of our application. We want to work with posts. Now, what I'm actually going to do in the public folder is I'm going to create a post.json file. This is kind of going to act as my fake database. I'm not going to set up a whole database here for this example video. So we're just going to consume data out of this JSON file. And because I put it in the public folder, this file will be exposed on the root address of the server. So I can just make a fetch request to /post.json on our server to get this data here. So let's create an array with JSON objects, and each post I'm going to give an ID. These are just some example placeholder posts just for this example. And let's call this the first post, or sorry, that's not, that should be the title. Let's give it the ID 1. I give it a title, and that will be first post. And let's give it some content, and we'll do some lorem ipsum. And I also would like to show you maybe a different module where we work with user accounts, just as a bit of mock data still, a bit of fake data. But I would like to store which user posted this post. So we'll also store a user ID for this post, and we'll just say that user ID 1 made this post. Let's copy it a few times, just so we have a few posts here. So the post with ID 2, we're going to call second post, and we'll say that user ID 2 posted it. Post ID 3, we're going to call third post, and we'll say that user ID 1 again has posted it, just so we have some random users here. And then ID 4, the fourth post, and we're going to create another user ID 3 for that later. Now we'll make user.json later. Let's go into posts and create a pages folder. So this is going to be all the pages that have to do with the kind of posts section of our component or of our application. So maybe the main overview or the main feed with all of the posts, maybe some kind of search page, maybe a page where we can create new posts, something like that. So let's create a main feed.tsx, and I just want this to show the latest post, or for now I'm just going to read all the posts from the JSON file and just show them. So let's export default function main feed. And this is simply going to need to fetch the data from the posts and then loop over them and create post components. So really what we want to do is when we return is, of course, we want the main layout and then the main element. But then within it, I need to basically loop over all of my posts. Let's actually add a little header, posts or all posts. And then we want to insert them here. Now what I could do is create an use effect and use fetch in there to fetch the JSON and then store it into state, which we have in this main feed component, and then have some other function that loops over them and renders post components, which we may define in this file as well. But those are all different actions, and I want to kind of separate all of those different actions. So in a moment, I'm going to separate the getting of the posts, the rendering of the posts, and the posts themselves into different files and different folders. But before we do that, we just want to make sure we can actually display this main feed page. So I'm going to, obviously we have our root router, and I could just say, well, if the path is /post, please show me the main feed component. But we might have multiple pages for the post module. So in posts, I'm actually going to make another routers folder. And what we can do is we can make a posts router specific for all of the pages that have to do with the posts. So let's export default function, the posts router. And this post router is going to return another set of routes from React Router DOM, and then one or multiple individual route components. And I'm going to say when the path is slash, this may be a bit strange because we already have a route in the root router for the path slash. But let's check it out. I'm going to render the element, specifically the component main feed. Now, if I go to the root router, obviously there is nothing in here for the path slash. And we haven't used this post router anywhere, so it doesn't do anything, right? If I go to the post page, we still have your post was not found. But what I'm going to do, in the root router, I'm going to create the path slash posts. And I'm going to render the element, the posts router. And what this basically allows us to do is nest routes. So we're saying here, if the path is slash post, please render the post router. And I've actually done something slightly wrong, but you will see all posts here. This is my post page, or the main feed page, all posts. I've actually done something slightly wrong because if I go to post slash something else, we actually get a 44 not found. But I might actually want to create a like post slash new page. And this is currently not handled by our post router. So really what I need to do is do a slash wildcard after it. So if the path matches posts and then anything, we'll handling that with the post router. So as long as the path starts with slash posts, it will be handled by the posts router. Now the post router then says, okay, well on top of that, if the path is slash, so we have already checked that the path starts with slash posts. If the path then is slash, we then render the main feed. But now the post slash new doesn't do anything. And that's because, well, currently we don't have a page for that, but also we no longer see that 44 not found. And really we should see the 44 not found page because we don't have a page for the new yet. We may later, but not right now. So in this router, and this is a slight annoyance, we just have to have another wildcard that just has the not found page here. So in case we have slash post slash and then something we haven't supported in the post router, we still want the 44 page. And there we go. But I can now go to posts and I can have all kinds of other sub pages for the post module, all listed down here in the post router. So this is like nested routing. The root router takes care of like your general pages and your module routers. This is kind of the router for the post module, and that module will take care of anything that comes after the module path, like slash posts. So that's going to be my router, and now we have the option to display this page. Let's go back to the page. So now I want to implement the functionality for the page, and I want to first get all of the posts. Now what I could do is create state, and then use effect, and I can create like a function to render the post, but that is all, you know, it's quite a lot of extra stuff. And really what I like my page components to be is really just the page itself. I don't care about the gathering of the data fetching. I don't care about in my pages. I want to hide that, abstract it away in a different file or a different function. I just want this page to be really just the layout, and if you're maybe using some CSS classes or Tailwind, just the layout and the content and the styling of this page. So what we can do is maybe create a custom hook. So I create a hooks folder for my custom hooks that have to do with posts. And I'm going to create a usePosts.ts file, not tsx because it's not going to render any tsx or jsx, but I'm going to create a usePost folder file. And this is simply going to export a normal TypeScript, in this case function, usePosts. And what I want this function to do is, because it's a hook, we can hook into React features, so we can actually use state. So we'll create a post and a set post state with use state. And I'm going to use a bit of TypeScript here to define a type for the data that we'll store in use state. So let's define an actual type for the posts. Now I'm not going to define it in the use post file because we might use the post type definition for other files as well. So I'm going to create a new folder for types. That's going to be my TypeScript type definitions. And I'm going to create a post type.ts. And like my main types for main data types that I'm going to create, I like to always append the type after that, so that I know it is actually a type definition. So let's export the type post type, which is going to be an object, and each post has an ID, which is a number. This is basically the same layout or the same structure as what we have in our JSON. So it will have an ID, it has a title, which will be a string, it has content, which will be a string, and then we also have a user ID, and that's going to be a number as well. And none of these will be optional. Every post will have an ID, title, content, and user ID. There we go. So that's going to be my post type. And now we simply can say, okay, this is going to be a post type array. So what we want to store in this state is of the type post type array, and it by default of course sets the undefined value, right? So there's nothing as the default value for use state. So right now the type is actually post type array or undefined. What I'm going to do is actually default it to an empty array, and now you can see that it is just an array with post types in it. Now the array could be empty like it is right now, and that's of course the initial state because we haven't fetched the post yet when the component that uses the usePost hook loads. So that's what we need to set up now. So let's create an async function that's going to data fetch the posts. Now for us it's just from this JSON file, but it could easily be from an external API on your server or some other place. So let's call this get posts or fetch posts really. That will be a little bit more semantically correct. Fetch posts. And this function is simply going to get a fetch response by awaiting fetch itself. And in our case, the address of our post is actually /posts.json because the public folder basically dumps all of the files in there in the root of your server. So we can just request this file from the root of the server. And then we have our, actually let's call this the posts response. And we will have our post data that we actually get out of the response by awaiting post response.json, which will parse the JSON file into JavaScript. So now our post data will actually be the data that we want to store. This is going to be the array of posts. So we could in theory now set posts and we give it the posts data. And then everyone will be happy. Now there's one other thing I would like to do. I would also like to apply the relation between the posts and the users. So we don't have users yet, but let's actually set it up right now. So I'm going to create a users.json file. And again, we'll have an array. This is like another table in our database, basically. And I'm going to say each user has its own ID. So we start with 1, and we'll just give them a username. And we'll start with John. Now let's see, I think we have 3 users, so ID 1, 2, 1, and 3. So we need 3 users. Let's copy this object. And another comma. So ID 2 will be Jane. And then we have an ID 3, and let's make it Devistry. There we go. So these are my 3 users in the database at the moment. So now I want to, for each post that we have found over here, I want to kind of loop over it and find the corresponding user object belonging to this user ID. So what we can do is take the post data, for each over it, and because we currently don't have any TypeScript data type definition for the post data, it's a bit annoying. So we can actually say, I think we can just do an s post type array, and I hope that this will work. Yeah, so now it knows the post data will be an array, and we're going to have post types in there. So post data is going to have a for each option on it now because we know it is going to be an array, and then for each post, and this will automatically, cannot find a post, sorry, this should be an arrow function first. So for each post, and TypeScript knows it is of the type post type because we literally loop over an array of post types. So there we go. So we have our each post, and we want to now find for each post the corresponding user. So let's create a user. Actually, let's first read the whole user file, and then we can just find in there. So let's create a const users response is await fetch, and then of course this will be /users.json, and then we kind of do the same over here. Const users data is await users response dot, and we read the JSON. Now we want to really set this up as a user type. So let's go and create another module here for users. And for now, I'm just going to create a types folder, and we'll create our user type.ts, export a type, user type. And if each user has an ID, which is a number, and then a username, which is a string. That's it. So now we can actually say, all right, so this is going to be an array as a user type array. And there we have it. So now we know this is going to be an array of users. So now that we have all of the type definition and the data fetched, we can say, okay, for each post, let's actually find in the user's data the user with the ID of this post, or the user ID of this post that made this post. So let's do const matching user is users data dot find, and we're basically looping over each user. And then we want to return true when the user.id matches the post.userID. So if that is returned true, it will actually return the current user we're iterating over, and that is going to be this matching user. But it might be undefined because maybe the find function didn't find a user. Maybe the user whose user ID is linked in the post doesn't exist anymore. So we basically need to check for that. So I'm going to say if matching user, if it is a true v value, if it has a value basically, if it's not undefined, we could hard code if it's not equal to undefined, but this basically does the same if this is any kind of value. If we have a matching user, then we want to take this post, and I basically want to give it a user. Now, I think we have to actually go back into the type definition for the post type, and I'm going to say user, and I'm going to give this the user type. So we can say, okay, well, we can actually save a property user, and that's actually a whole user type, but I'm going to make it optional. So this may be undefined. So, because if we haven't found a matching user, we obviously will not have a user in the post itself. But if we have a matching user, I can simply say post.user is that matching user. And because matching user is of the type user type, that all works out. So now we have created a nice little hook here that gets all of the posts. There's one thing we forgot: we never call fetch posts. So we actually have to do that in a use effect, because we want to do this when the component mounts, and when we then want to run the side effect. Side effects are basically interacting with external services or data, like our post JSON file. These are not part of the React application, they're just random files. So we need to use a side effect to do that. Fetching is pretty much always a side effect. So in this use effect, we're going to just say get, or fetch posts. Just execute it. And this is going to set the posts in the state. Now, we never need to rerun this use effect. So we'll give it an empty dependency array. There's no dependencies values we want to check for if they're changed to rerun the fetch post. There's no need for that. We just want to do it once when the component mounts. And then finally, at the end of this whole hook, we just return those posts. And these posts are the array of post types, which we now have fetched. And we have also inserted the users for if they exist. So this hook is a function that simply keeps track of its own posts. It does its own data fetching, it has its own use effect, but it simply returns the value posts. So now in the main feed, and this is why we set up this whole hook, we have abstracted all of that functionality away out of the page itself. Another beauty of this is we can reuse this hook in another page if that page also needs to get all of the posts. So now we simply use posts, and this will simply return us that array of post types. Now, next what I want to do is basically iterate over all of the posts and create post components. So I usually have my rendering functions as a separate function. So we'll call this render posts. And I'm just going to return posts.map. So post.map is going to create a new array based on the information in the current posts array. And we're going to return that new array. I basically want to map the posts, which are objects with the post data, to an array of components representing the post in HTML. So basically it's not a for each loop for each post. And again, TypeScript knows this is of the type post type because we're iterating over a post type array. So for each post we want to return, and basically I want to return a post component. Now we don't have that yet, so let's go back into the post module, create a folder for all of the individual components. Now components are different than my pages. The pages are the main pages themselves on the actual screen, kind of the root of the page we're currently on. But each page may represent a collection of other components on that page. So in the components folder here, I'm going to make a post component here. And this is just this component will just be there to map or show post information. So we give it a post object, a post type object, and we want to show it in JSX as a component. So a function post, and we are going to return basically just a div, and we could style it, but I'm not going to bother. And then we want to have our actual post data, and it's going to be of the type post type. So now we can reuse that. Let's see, property post doesn't exist on post type. Oh, sorry, it's going to be an object where the post is of the type post type. So of course props is itself an object, and one of the properties is post, which will be of the type post type. So now we can have an h2, let's say, for the post.title, and we can have maybe a span for the post.user.username. Now we have to be careful here because user is potentially undefined. If I remove this question mark here, it's going to say that post.user is possibly undefined. And if we were trying to read the username from a value that is undefined, obviously, that will create an error. So I'm actually going to put this whole span in a little check. We're going to say post.user, and then, only then, will we run the span with the post.user.username. So we just ignore the span if this is false, basically, if it's a null or undefined value. But we should always have the content of the post. So we'll just render that in this paragraph, and that should be everything for this post. So now we have a nice little abstracted away post component, and then for each of the posts we want to add a post component, which will need the post data, and that's going to be the post from the loop. And because we're adding components to a list, they also need an individual key, and they need a unique value, so we can just simply use post.id for that, because it will be unique in this list. So the render post will convert the array of posts with objects, the post data or post type array, into an actual array of JSX elements, or specifically of post components. So here below our h1, we can simply call render posts, execute it, and this is going to insert that array of elements over here. They are all keyed, so they will be displayed in the right order, and React can manage them. And look at that, on the post page we now have all of our posts, and it seems like the finding of the user worked out right as well, so that's perfect. So this is a pretty basic setup of pages. What I like my pages to do is gather all of the information, ideally through hooks, because data fetching is usually many lines of code. Well, maybe not many, but a few lines at least. So I usually abstract it away under a hook, also so I can reuse that hook to fetch that data in other components. And then I have my functions that maybe iterate over a list of items to convert it into a list of JSX elements. And then I have my just actual HTML for that page. So there we have that. So that is pretty cool here. And you're starting to see why and how we're using all of these folders here, right? So we just have every module have its own sub-module folder, and that will have whatever things that module is going to need: pages, routers, hooks, components, utility functions, type definitions, I don't know, whatever you're going to need, assets like images, whatever you want, you put them in these modules. So next up, let's focus a bit more on the users. So what I would like to do is to create a page where we kind of have our user profile, which just shows us like who is logged in. So we need to create some very rudimentary and very bad login system, but it's all for the example here. So we need to be able to log in someone and then kind of have a profile page where we show information for the user, like the username. And I also want to be able to log in as a different user. And then maybe I want to be able to find all of the posts made by that user. So there's a couple of things we will do in the user folder here. So let's go there. So I think the user deserves its own router. And I always call the folder routers because you may want to have multiple nested routers. Usually it's just one though, so it's a bit overkill to maybe put the routers in their own folder, but it helps with organization. So user router, export default function user router. And this is simply going to export default, no, not export default, it's going to return, it's almost the same, exporting or returning. It's going to return a routes collection and then one route for now, which is going to be the path / and the element, which we'll have to define in a moment, is going to be my profile page, basically. For now, we'll just render null. And then we also need a fallback over here. Route, and the path will be the wildcard selector, anything, and the element is going to be the not found for component page. So now in the root router, we of course need to implement another subroute for users. And we're going to render the user router. All right, maybe I just call this user because we never have multiple users logged in at one time, of course. So naming convention will be singular users. And I think I might also rename this to be singular user as well, because we also have user router, user type. So those will be just singular. Okay. So in our layout navbar, we can now simply add a new link to /user, and we'll call this profile. And we should just see the 404 page. Oh, actually, no, we render null at the moment. But if I go to user / something that doesn't exist, we have the 404 page. So now we just have this navbar updated in this one layout folder, and any page that uses this main layout or that uses the navbar will get that added. So that's really nice. It's just all about code reusability. So let's close posts here, go into the user and create a pages folder for that profile page. Make it a TSX file, export default function. So it's a bit of repetition, always export default function. You might want to create a little snippet for that actually. But I just always spell it out, it doesn't take too long. And then we return and the main layout again, because all my pages will have that main layout. Now you can also have different layouts if some of your pages use some different layout. Like let's say your home page has the main layout, but then you have some kind of dashboard which you want a different layout for. You could of course just set up a different layout component for that. We have the main HTML element. And then in here we basically want to gather the user's data. So really what I want is an H1 that says hello and then the username. So right now, oh, and we never added the page to the router. So there we go, profile. There we have it. So now it just says hello user. So what I would like to do is store in some kind of global accessible state which user is logged in. And then I want to consume that global user state in this profile page so that we can, for example, read information about the user like the username. And we can maybe say hello and then the username. So what I'm going to set up is a context provider for the user. And I'm going to put it in a providers folder for the user module. So we'll create a UserContextProvider. Now, if you're unfamiliar, React has a system called context, which allows you to expose values to multiple components or even a global value, basically to all components. And I want this context provider to store which users logged in and then expose that data to any component that wants to get it. So in order to do that, we have to export a constant variable, which I'm going to call UserContext. This is actually going to store all of the information about the context, and we create it with createContext. There we go. Now TypeScript wants to know a default value. So I'm actually going to give it a type first, and it's going to be the user type. Actually, there are going to be multiple values in here, but for now we'll leave it to user type. So we're going to create a context for the user type. And then we're going to say or null. So I'm actually going to set the null value there by default. So by default, there is no user currently logged in. So there's either a user type or null in the context. And now we need to create a context provider, which takes the value that's in this context. This is kind of like your state almost. And then we create a provider which uses the context to expose these types, these values, to all of its children components. So let's export default now, a actual function component called UserContextProvider. And this actually is going to take children, because we need to have children elements and components to expose the value to. So I'm actually going to create a quick type here for UserContextProvider props. And again, we have children, and that's simply going to be react.reactNode. And we're going to say that this is of the type UserContextProvider props. There we go. So in this context provider, we need to have the state that actually stores the value that the context is going to expose. So we're going to store our user and the set user function, of course. And we're going to say that this will also store either a user type or null. And the default value, just like the context, will be null. Now we are going to return a component based on the user context, and it has a provider component, and that's what we're going to create. And we're going to wrap this provider around the children elements and components. Now the provider needs a value prop, and this is the actual value in our context provider that matches the type we have in here. So we'll set up value, and we're going to set the user to be the value. So this works right now, but it's not functional, but at least we can now expose the value null, which is the default value at the moment. We can expose that to the whole application. Well, not yet, but to any of the children that we're going to wrap this provider around. So let's go back all the way to the app provider, and I'm going to, let's actually fill this fragment, set the user context provider to wrap around my router. Now the router is going to basically represent every page. So we are in essence exposing the value of the user context provider to every page, including my profile page. So let's go there. Now, in order to consume this data, we need to use the useContext hook. So let's read the user is useContext, import that from React. And now we need to also get the context we want to read. And that's going to be this user context that we have exported, user context. Now, because this adds quite a few imports and we have to actually think about which context, I'm actually going to expose this or wrap this in a hook. So in the user folder, let's create a hooks folder, and I'm going to call this useUser. And this hook will always just return the user from the user context. So let's export default. And this also helps with code reusability, because we might need to use the user in other components as well. So function and use for making it a hook, user. And this is simply going to do this task here. Now we have no need for these imports, this import. We don't need to think about which imports we need. We just import the use context here, the user context here. And then we're simply going to, actually we just return this. We are going to return whatever is returned from use context. It's just a little wrapper function. It's almost too much work for the reusability, but now we have a nice use user hook that is reusable. Now in the profile, I would like to read that user. So use user is now the only thing we need. And this is just very nice in the page itself. It just hides any of the functionality, of which there's very little, but still it hides it, abstracts it behind that function. So now we have this user, which is either a user or null. So we probably want to have this in a conditional as well. So again, we'll say user. And this time I'm going to say we want a question mark for a ternary operator. And if the user is true, so then the element after the ternary operator will be made. So then we're just simply going to insert user.username. So if we have a user, we should also have a username. Else, well, then I want to just show a paragraph login. And we're going to create another login component here in a moment. So now what we should do, what it should do is it should actually show us login, because we haven't logged in yet. Well, let's create that next. I'm going to create a components folder, and we'll create a login.tsx component. And this is part of the user module again, because logging in has to do with users. Export default function login. Now what I'm doing here is not a secure or not a normal login system. What I'm basically going to do is have a form where we can enter a username, and whichever user has that username will just simply add to the context provider as the current user. There's no password involved. There can be multiple users with the same name, obviously. So if I have another John in the database and I enter the username John in my login form, which of the two Johns do we want? So obviously that makes no sense, but for the example it will work just fine. So this login component is going to house a form. So let's return a form. And we'll have an input of the type text with the placeholder username. And this will be a self-closing element, of course. And then we'll also have a button of the type submit. I always like to explicitly state the type submit, even though buttons in a form will by default submit them, but I like to be explicit. And then we'll say login. So this will have a form with the username and then the login button. So we'll make this work in a moment, but let's actually replace this paragraph. So when there's no user, we want to have the login form. So the profile page decides to show the actual profile information or a login component. And there we have that login component. We might actually have a little fragment around this and a little h1 login. And there we go. That makes a bit more sense. So now we need to store the value in the input in React state so that we can always read it. Let's create some state and we'll call this the username. Set username is useState. This useState is going to store an empty string by default, which also sets the type of the username, so we don't have to specify that with a generic type. And then in the onChange event of the input, we basically want to match the value of the input to the state. So I'm going to create an arrow function taking in the event, and we're going to say set username with the e.target.value. So that will be the value of the element that triggered the event. Target is always the element that triggered the event, which should be this element, the input. And we're just reading the value from that. And the value of the input should always match the username. So if the username is changed from some other place, the input should change with it as well. So now we have a two-way dependency between the state and the input. Whenever the input is changed, the state is changed. Whenever the state is changed, the input is changed because the value will be the username. So now we can actually manage the username value in this input field. And now we need an onSubmit handler, and that should save the user as the user that we are basically saying is logged in our UserContextProvider. So let's create a function called onSubmit. And we'll also say get the event data here. And we'll figure out the type in a moment. But first in the form, we'll say onSubmit to actually grab the actual event. And it's actually an HTML form event. So we'll just copy that. And we're going to actually just pass the onSubmit function in there to be the handler. And it's going to be that HTML form element. Actually, element, no, it should be an event. So let's see, onSubmit. Oh, maybe it already knows it. No, it's any. So what kind of event would it be? It doesn't actually tell me. That's kind of annoying. So let's try form event. There's a form event. This may just be it. So let's just check it out. What I really want is e.prevent default. There we go, we can find it. So that's the correct type. So prevent default cancels the default behavior of the form, which would be to send the data in the inputs to some kind of URL. We don't want that. We want to keep this data internally in the app. We don't need to go to a different page or a different website altogether. We don't need to send this in a post request to our server. It's just going to be a form that will stay internally within the app. So don't do anything in the form, but then we want to use this username and set it, or first, of course, find the user from the database and set its object to be the logged in user. Now what I'm going to do is in the UserContextProvider, I'm going to define another function in here that will allow us to log a user in. So we have our state that saves the user, but we also have a set user, of course, but I don't want to expose this set user directly. I want to do that through a setter function. So let's create an async function, logInWithUsername. Login with username, and this will take a username of the type string as a parameter, and then we need to find in all of the users in the JSON file which user matches that username. So we're kind of going to do the same as with our posts and the usePosts. We need to find all of the users. Let's just copy that. All right, and paste it in here. So find all of the users, and this is correct. And then we need to find in the user data, so matching user. We need to loop over all of the users in the user's data and find for each user. We want to find the user where the user.username matches the username, there we go, in our parameter. If there is a matching user, we then want to set the user in the state to be that matching user. Only if. Otherwise, we'll leave it as null or whatever the previous user was basically. So now whenever we run this function and we supply it with a username and it matches, the user state will be updated, and because the user state is exposed as the value of the provider, any component that consumes that user will be updated. So then this condition statement will maybe now trigger that there is a user and show the user's username. There's one thing that's missing currently. We cannot run this login with username function from my login form, obviously, because it's in a completely different component. So what we can do, however, is instead of exposing just the user, we're going to expose an object containing the user, but also my login with username function. So we'll have an object with both the user and the login with username function. But TypeScript is not really going to like this, because the type definition here of the user context, of course, doesn't match the type that we are exposing here in the value. And also actually the state is fine. It can be a user or null, but the context type now is completely wrong. So let's get rid of this default value as well. And in create context, we're going to say that we will expose an object, and we might actually create a whole type definition for this. So I'm going to create a type, and I don't think we need to export it. I think I'm just going to call it UserContextType. And it's going to be an object containing a user, which is either the user type or null. So that's the thing in our state. And then we also have a login with username. And that's going to be a function that takes in a string. I think we just do it like this. And it returns void. Actually, I think we might need to call this user name of the type string. Yeah, there we go. So login with username takes a username of the type string and it returns void. Doesn't return anything. And now our create context is simply going to get that user context type. Now it is complaining about the default value. I don't really need the default value, I think. So because we will always expose this. So let me just Google quickly what we do if we don't have a default value. So I haven't found the cleanest solution, but I think the best way to do it is to just say that this could be undefined, and then we just pass undefined as the default value. Now the reason why we do that is, yes, we are adding a value always in the provider, but TypeScript doesn't know if we actually implemented the user provider. Only then will it, of course, assign a value to the user context. So we're just saying the user context is undefined by default. And then if at some point we do initialize the context provider, which in practice in our app will happen immediately, then we override it with the actual user context type. This does, however, mean that in our login, so we now want to use the useUser hook to consume the user context. So my useUser simply returns the user context type or undefined. So we now need to check that we only want to do that if the value is not undefined, obviously. So I think we may just, maybe we can do this within user. I don't think so. No, I think we just need to check in the place where we're using the functionality. So let's use useUser. Now, ideally, I would like to destructure logInWithUsername from useUser, but this is probably going to complain because the type that useUser returns can be user context type or undefined, and that is correct. It could be undefined. So we can't destructure that. I can kind of force it to be as the user context type, and for that I would need to export it. So I'm not going to do that because it could still in practice be undefined. So I think what we really need to do here is just call this actually user context. And then we simply do a user context dot login with username, and we use the conditional chaining operator, I think it's called, which will only do whatever is past the question mark if the thing on the left is a true v value, if it has a value. So then we will log in with username, which requires the user name, and that should log us in. I think that is the best solution here for us. So I'm not too sure about the user naming here. Yeah, user context would work. We could also call this useUserContext. That would make a little bit more sense, I think. useUserContext, and we'll rename this. That would make a little bit more sense. Import that, or change the updoor imports, and like that. So why is it complaining here? Cannot find module. useUserContext export. That should be right. Weird. And my profile is still complaining because it also uses the user, but the login should work. And then here we want to let's just remove this UserContext. So if UserContext is there, we should have a user. And actually I'm going to do .user. Maybe. Actually we'll do this, and then no, actually we will check for the user, and then we can just do UserContext.user.username there. Otherwise we'll render login. So now, hopefully, if I did all of this right, we are not currently logged in, and we can check this if you're using the... Ooh, lots of errors. Okay, those are old errors. If you're using the React DevTools in the as a Chrome extension, we can actually check all of the elements here. And there's our UserContextProvider. And there's the value we currently are exposing. And you can see user is still null. Now, let's look for the user John. Let's see if this is going to work. So, login. And look at that, the context changed to an actual user object. And look at that, my login also changed because the context changed, the state in the context changed. And then any component that consumes the context will be updated if they're using something that has been updated, like the state. So the user has changed. So that means that this conditional conditional will happen again. We check if the user context user exists. And if so, we will render the H1, otherwise we log in. Pretty cool stuff. This could be a bit more clean. So maybe we would wrap this in another component, but I don't think I want to spend too much more time on this. So you get the idea. So now have, maybe we would just, I think we'll leave it there. I mean, we could implement a logout button, and we could implement like a search for all of the posts for just this user and all kinds of stuff, making new posts, deleting them, whatever. I think this makes it clear enough to how to set up a good structure for your project, common modules, or well, common components, pages, whatever, routers, and then modules with their components, hooks, routers, types, providers, whatever. So I hope that you found this useful as a nice little app that we can build with React and TypeScript, and how we do it according to this modular file structure, folder structure. Hope that you find this useful. If you want to see more of these videos and my live streams, make sure you subscribe and press that bell button so you get alerted when I go live and when I announce a new live stream, when a new video goes live. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching and goodbye.